Good evening and namaskar, and welcome to the first episode of Africa Talks, a series of discussion which we have planned during this time, and we'll be focusing on contemporary issues on pressing social, economic, business, and cultural themes which have immense relevance for African society, economy, business, and most important, for African people within the continent and outside it. Today we just got a news that in India the lockdown has been extended for another 2 weeks, and I think there is similar scenario in most of the countries around the globe. Unfortunately, in the mainstream media, why we have been getting almost 24 into 7 reporting about what is happening in US, what is happening in Italy, what is happening in China, in Singapore, in Taiwan, but none of us are actually getting to know that what is the current scenario in Africa, how the African countries are fighting this challenge of novel coronavirus. Also, we are finding that Africa is somehow missing in the global geopolitical discussions and the narratives that are being there in media. So one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion was to first get an insight what exactly is happening in African countries, how prepared are African governments in finding this in fighting with this pandemic, and what repercussions it will have on African society and economy in the post-COVID era. Today we have three very eminent panelists with us from different parts of the world who will be sharing their perspectives and thoughts about today's theme. I would like to welcome Mr. Iziogo Namdi, who is a promoter of Pan-African Solidarity and is also co-founder of Exilient Africa.
Thank you very much.
Our second panelist today is Mr. Mubarak Rabiu, who is CEO and founder of MRK Group Africa, and he's from Nigeria. Welcome, Mr. Mubarak, to the show. And our third panelist is Ms. Pearl Emefa from Ghana, who has an interest in international relations and global politics. And today, we would like to know more about Africa from these three important panelists. Before going ahead with the program, I would like to request all the panelists to give their opening remarks and how they would like to see the topic which we have, in which perspective they would like to see it and contextualize it, that how Africa is missing in global narratives around the novel coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Iziogo.
Thank you very much. It's been very interesting because for a very long time we have been locked down, and there's not been an opportunity for us to even interact like this. So, but with the advent of technology, there's been a lot of tremendous improvement. It shows that the world is actually taking a different dimension in the way things operate. And most importantly, looking at the thematic for today on Africa missing in the global conversation and discussion around the COVID-19 pandemic. I think Africa is not actually missing. It's just that if it's not just related to this issue, because generally there's a way that information from Africa is being censored, probably because from a political perspective, we are not comfortably sitting on the table. There is no mutuality in the relationship that exists between Africa and the rest of the world. Otherwise, Africa is doing tremendously very well. Just a few days back, a lot of countries in Africa, from Madagascar to Senegal to Benin Republic, Ghana, even Nigeria today or the day before yesterday, discovered ways, innovative ways of treating and handling this pandemic. So for Africa not being in the conversation is probably because in the international politics itself, if you look at the major world powers, there is no African country there. If you look at developed economies, there are less African countries that are considered as developed economies. Internet connectivity, electricity, and so many other factors contribute to the reason why Africa is lacking in this conversation. But for the approach, in terms of the approach and in terms of resilience in fighting and combating this virus, the pandemic, I think Africa is playing a huge role. The rest of the world just have to accept that and join hands with Africa to collectively, because in the end of the day, at the end of the day, this is an issue that affects us all. So the world has to join hands with Africa, accept what we've done so far, the cures which we've been able to, the remedies which we've been able to invent, or if not say invent because they've been there, but bring into the limelight. These things has to be appreciated. So I
Great.
think
So we'll come back to that point again, Iziogo, later in the program. I would like to go now to Mr. Mubarak to give his opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. My name is yeah.
Mr. Mubarak, we are not able to. I think there is some audio problem there. So we'll get back to you very soon. I will now go on to Ms. Pearl Siale and I would request her to give her opening remarks for today's discussion.
Thank you very much. I would want to extend some greetings to, people watching us all over the globe. Currently in Ghana, we are celebrating our May Day, which is equivalent to Labor Day across, in different countries. So I want to say a big congratulations to all our front line health workers out there and the tremendous work they are doing towards addressing COVID-19 in Africa and the rest of the world. Basically, I don't think Africa is missing in ways they're trying to address the global pandemic. I would want to agree with Eziogu on that point, where he stated that we are not missing, but I would like to link it to the fact that probably Africa is not being heard because of the fact that there was a late detection of the virus in our continent. Also, I'd like to agree with him again that probably may be due to lack of internet access in some countries, power cuts, and some other factors. But I don't think Africa is missing. We are also doing very well, tremendously well in addressing the pandemic. A lot of countries are being innovative. In Ghana, we've already started developing our test kits. We are locally producing our PPEs. And I know several other African countries are doing tremendously well in order to contain and to prevent the virus.
Wonderful. I think that's a lot of positive news coming from Africa. Mr. Mubarak, can we have your remarks now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Okay, my name is Mubarak Abiu. I'm an entrepreneur from Nigeria. I'm based in Abuja. So as I speak right now, Abuja, Lagos, and Ogun are under lockdown for almost 5 weeks, just like across African countries. So our lockdown is now been 5 weeks. They said they are going to open it by next week. And with the media, I think Nigeria has been doing a lot to educate people through various ways, like through the TV, through internet, protect themselves. And right now, many entrepreneurs and companies have been able to turn their manufacturing to what is the matter of the day. Like so many universities, so many factories are now producing sanitizers. So many local tailors and big tailoring companies are turning their manufacturing facility to do face masks and also personal protective equipment. So I think Nigeria and Africa has done a lot in this pandemic, as I've seen it has taken over the whole world, but Africa is also trying to do what it can for its people.
Great. So let's go ahead with the discussion. Day before yesterday, I read a report, a very detailed report on health infrastructure of Africa. And it had some startling revelations, like there are only 2,000 ventilators available in 41 African countries. There are 10 African countries with not a single ventilator. And in several countries, there are no medical staff to operate those medical equipments. So do you think, like the last pandemic that was there in Africa was Ebola in 2014, if I'm not wrong. And after that, several steps were taken by various African states as well as by multilateral agencies like World Bank and WHO to improve the health infrastructure and services in Africa. Do you think the steps that were taken 4 years, 5 years back are giving any positive results now in fighting with COVID? It's open to all of you. Anyone can start.
You should start.
Yes, fun.
Yeah, the lady first, please.
Okay, for me personally, I think Africa has done tremendously well in targeting, in dealing with the pandemic. And looking at the WHO reports, you realize that they've made claims that Africa is being able to manage the pandemic well because of their experiences they went through with Ebola. It has built the economy and made it more resilient to face this pandemic. But we have to admit the fact that even Western countries are even finding it very difficult to face this pandemic. It's a general problem, it's a global problem, and it's going to be tough for every country, no matter how prepared you are to face this pandemic. But with the issue of ventilators and health facilities, it's true, no doubt that Africa is faced with a very fragile health system. Aside that, we have other issues going on like conflicts and wars. Already the health systems are already burdened. From WHO, Africa is going to need about 30,000 ventilators and all that. But I think AU and other individual countries are really trying hard to raise funds. For Ghana in particular, we've opened a COVID-19 fund, which has received huge amounts of money. Local invention is also going on. People are trying to develop ventilators. I think innovation has become a necessity due to the COVID-19. So in as much as we are struggling in terms of acquiring medical equipment to solve the pandemic, I think we are innovating in our own way, producing our own ventilators, as I said earlier, producing our test kits, and producing other protective equipment. I don't think every country is going to take the repercussion of this virus lightly. It's going to affect all of us in the same way. And even though with our weak or fragile health system, I think we are doing very well and we are going to sail through, hopefully.
Great. Iziogo.
Yeah, I'm someone who, when we talk about the dilapidated infrastructure, health infrastructure in Africa, I always want to coordinate it with or relate it with the international relations and politics, because that's where we always come back to. Though we can be able to innovate and invent our own technologies, because that's where we're lacking. In terms of the buildings, we have a lot of beautiful buildings, but in terms of equipping these buildings, that's where we have issues. And the fact is, sometimes the international community determines the kind of technology that we acquire. And sometimes there are certain global standards that you have to meet, which for some reasons, some individuals or group of people or organizations determine who scales through in such terms of ratings. And more importantly would be also leadership there in Africa, because there are millions being budgeted all the time for infrastructure such as this, but with little being done in terms of delivering the same technologies. And when you have these technologies, another issue would be the intellectual knowledge, the knowledge to actually manage these technologies. And for so many reasons, that's why you see a lot of Africans in diaspora studying medical related courses and management, hospitality and management. But the fact is, when they return, they really get the enabling environment to actually continue. But in terms of traditional practices, Africa is doing tremendously well. A lot of like you have in Ayurveda and the likes in India and the rest of the world. We have our own practices, and for so many reasons, these practices are evolving. And even the COVID antidote that was discovered in Madagascar was by herbal means. In Nigeria also, I think in Yobe, if Mubarak would confirm that, there is a traditional medicine practitioner who had also discovered a cure for this. So I think in so many ways we're trying, but we do require the international community to play the role of giving us that mutuality and respect, not just in accessing our resources and minerals in terms of human capital and natural resources, but also enabling us in terms of technology transfer and the like, so that there's full independence and we don't have to go through all this. Because as I usually tell you, Mr. Narendra, today is the world's turn. Tomorrow it's Africa's responsibility to take care of the world. And
Wonderful.
if you don't
Great.
plan for your future, this now is a message to the world. If the world does not plan for its future, which is Africa, then I think whatever they get in the future, they should welcome it.
Wonderful. Let's go to Mr. Mubarak now.
Yeah. So the reality you talked about the healthcare system in Africa, yes, we need to do a lot. We need to invest more. And I think most importantly, we need to innovate in our own ways. But what you should understand, or the reality is that due to globalization, just as we know China is for manufacturing, many Africans also go to India for healthcare. So because of globalization, it's now easy to get a visa and go to India, US, Germany, Egypt, or elsewhere you want to go to. So the middle class and the elite in Africa fly for healthcare. But this pandemic has given us a new challenge. So I think right now is the best time for us to fix our healthcare system. So if the elite and the rich and the middle class can also invest in healthcare, I think it will help us a lot. But as it stands, because of globalization, most people travel to, especially India, if you can testify for healthcare tourism. So right now you can't travel anywhere. So I think now is the best time for us to invest more and do more, just in case of pandemics like this. But globalization has changed the whole scenario. Right now, if you need something, you can easily travel to another country and have the best service. Like I think every year, hundreds, if not thousands of Africans and other people from other parts of the world come to India for health tourism.
Yeah, but I think that's confined to a very small percentage of people who have the resources and money to come to India. And when it comes to millions of poor Africans, like we have in India, millions of people who don't have access to healthcare infrastructure and services. It reminds me of the Abuja Declaration that happened in 2001, where African countries had pledged that they will, prioritize healthcare system and give 15% of their budget for improving the health infrastructure in the country. But unfortunately, in the last 19 years, it has not happened. So I think this pandemic also provides an opportunity for various groups to work to put pressure on the governments in their respective states to ensure what they had committed way back in 2001 in the Abuja Declaration. So going ahead with the next issue, Iziogo, when we had a discussion earlier also, you had a lot of emphasis on the Pan-African Brotherhood. And Africa has also realized, whether it was Ebola or it's malaria or it's HIV, they have realized that, single state cannot fight these kind of pandemics. They are dependent on each other. And that's how the Pan-African, brotherhood, took shape. But do you think in the present global pandemic, Africa has a unified voice, or they are fighting together? or still the different African states have their own priorities and have their own ways and mechanisms to fight the pandemic? Do you see any kind of African solidarity or a unified African steps being taken by AU or any other body in Africa?
Exactly. At this moment, you would also recall that the current man at the front of this virus is, I mean, the pandemic itself is an
Yeah.
African, and just like I mentioned, a lot of African countries have developed remedies, and a lot of research is ongoing for the cure for this virus. Now, test kits that are being manufactured and other materials, medical equipment being manufactured in Africa are being circulated within Africa. So you see neighboring African countries patronizing those equipments that are being produced in nearby countries. And that is a huge plus, because what we've been always preaching for is actually, people are actually coming to the realization that the Pan-African Renaissance is the only way. The only way we can actualize that is by uniting for a common purpose. I mean, for progress, because progress is the only thing that can keep everyone on deck. If a singular country in Africa, say Nigeria, is more advanced than Ghana, or the Gambia, which is a close by country, or even Cameroon, then I don't think we can conclusively say Nigeria is a developed country. So one cannot be a king and live in a palace whereby the followers are all living on trees. It doesn't make any sense. So the best way, I think, African countries, the AU, have realized that, and since its formation, the AU have been working very hard. The only thing we still have as a challenge, I think I was having a conversation with a diplomat friend who mentioned about the Banjul agreement, which was supposed to be upheld by the respective African countries, but due to this imperialism and neo-colonial pressure that Africa is experiencing, whereby people still have vested interest and some other people want to still continue control, then it makes it very difficult, because a lot of interest comes into the picture. But with this, because this is a matter of life and death, if you had told me that I would stay indoors for 2 months, the day before the lockdown, I would not have agreed. And while the pandemic was happening in China, we thought it was just a small issue that the Chinese government is going to curb, but that didn't happen. So we've realized right now the need for unity, and not just from a Pan-African perspective, but as a global, as the entire of humanity needs this right now.
Right.
India, just like Madagascar, has been able to develop this product, or even Nigeria. With the existing bilateral relationship, there's nothing stopping the Indian government from requesting support from Madagascar or Nigeria or any of the countries. So I think humanity should come first. We shouldn't play politics with this, neither should we commercialize things, or play the capitalist angle, but more first is eradicating this pandemic. And if you recall, Africa has done the same in previous times, not just with the Ebola. There are a lot of plagues that have hit the world in previous times that Africa stood firm, and the world got healed from this. So I think we just need to come together collectively and fight this, because there's also going to be a post-COVID-19 issue that we all have to still face. So I think coming together is the only thing, and Africa is doing best on that now.
Great. Pod.
Yeah. I also want to side with Eziogu. I think Africa is doing very well in coming together to address the pandemic. We should bear in mind that AU has done a lot in terms of procuring PPE, sending money to other African countries. And we need to know that even the chairperson of the AU now is faced with one of the worst cases in his country, Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. He's acting both as the chairperson of the AU and at the same time addressing his own issue in his country, which is leading the African cases. South Africa is recording close to 6,000 cases right now. So it's not easy for him per se, but recently I just read in the news that he's been able to form a 4-member committee with people with high dignity and interesting profiles that are ready to, source for funding to be able to help address the pandemic in various African countries. And for me, I always stand by the fact that this pandemic needs a regional, address system. We need to fight together, because if Ghana is able to eradicate this pandemic, Nigeria can bring it in. If Nigeria has not been able to eradicate it, if Nigeria is able to eradicate it, and let's say Senegal or any other African country has not been able to eradicate it, it's going to come in, because you are going to open borders. And most of the time, there's a lot of migration within African countries. Madagascar just developed COVID organics, and I've seen quite a number of African countries going into to order for the medicine that we believe can address COVID-19. It's not as if it's we can't say that it's a totally new invention, but for us it's a new invention because no one knew that those herbs can be related to solving COVID-19. And I think that's what other African countries should do if we need to form a unified front to fight this pandemic. We need to develop our own stuff and because there's a general shortage of PPEs across the globe. How are we sure that if there's a vaccine or there's a cure or a treatment for COVID-19, it's not also going to short and it's going to be the survival of the fittest, where the rich countries will be able to bid for it better than the poor countries? So in a way, I think Africa needs to come together. If it means developing our own treatments and our cure, even if it's not going to be accepted by the global world, at least we have the purchasing power to purchase our own cure and to be able to.
I think that's a very valid point. Let's go to Mr. Mubarak now.
Yeah. So as they have all said, 5 months ago, if you said something like this will happen, nobody will agree. So just as it's now everywhere in the world, most of the countries and economies are struggling. It also happened in Africa. So, but in Africa, we have the AU and we also have blocks like the East African bloc, South African bloc, and the ECOWAS. So I think the ECOWAS actually tried to stop it earlier on the movement of people. But as you know, different countries have different realities on the ground. Like Nigeria is different from Benin and Ghana. So Ghana has done a lot to stop it, as she said. But I think in the future, this has shown us that we need to be more proactive in stopping cases like this. So this is something that is new to the world. So I believe in the future, if anything happens, we can be able to coordinate it better and more proactive. Because initially we thought it was something in China, but right now it has affected the whole global economy. So I think Africa has done a lot, but in the future we have to be more proactive as a bloc, because like for the ECOWAS, there's free movement. So in the future, I believe ECOWAS can be able to stop movement and things like that to be more proactive so that it doesn't affect our economy and our people.
Sure.
Yeah.
So coming to the changing geopolitical scenario in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we have seen, a different kind of power tussle has started. And it was quite visible when Mr. Donald Trump decided to freeze funding to WHO. What do you think Africa as a continent, what kind of impact this is going to have, especially when WHO and World Bank have been supporting a lot of projects and programs in Africa, specifically in the healthcare sector? Do you think if any kind of freeze or any kind of shortage of funds, happens in WHO or other multilateral agencies, it's going to have a negative impact on Africa's ability to fight with COVID-19 pandemic? So open to all of you.
For me, okay.
Yes, Pearl. Yes, Pearl.
Personally, I think yes, it's going to really have a strong impact on the activities in Africa, because as we all know, WHO is one of the major donors to most of African countries. They've done tremendously well in providing most African countries with PPEs, with testing kits and all that. And we should know that before this pandemic started, it was only in 2 countries where you could test for COVID-19. But right now, with efforts of WHO, close to 48 countries out of the 54 countries on the continent can test for COVID-19 in their respective countries. Aside that, US is one of the major donors to WHO. US contributes close to 1.27 billion US dollars over the 2-year funding cycle of WHO in terms of their dues and in terms of their voluntary donations. And I think this is a very, this is not a good time for US to threaten to pull out from their funding to WHO. And I hope their decision is rethought, because as it's hinted, WHO will need close to about $300 million to still fight this epidemic after and other epidemics such as malaria and HIV. I think it's really going to have a huge toll on most African countries. As you can see, we depend greatly on this international body. So I hope the decision of the US to pull out its funding will be rethought once again.
Ijogo, would you like to add something?
For the US, actually, they are the world power and actually play a huge role in terms of dictating the way things go around the world. At such a critical time, if the United States of America leadership can take such a position, if they are suspecting issues of non-deliverance in terms of the contributions which they make, what they should do is just to put in modalities. If they need help in doing that, there are a lot of NGOs and organizations and individuals that are committed to the eradication of the pandemic that would contribute technological wise in terms of serving as a task force to actually guide what they are doing. But when the leadership of the United States at such a critical time can take such a step to stop funding when the funding is needed, I mean, we're not talking about funding wars. We are talking about funding health institutions, such like the WHO, to actually fight this pandemic. So it goes a long way to tell us the kind of leadership that is there. But I would not want to comment much on this because it's more political. And, you know, for so many reasons, we're trying to keep politics out of this conversation, so that at the end of the day, we don't just discuss, but also come up with solutions to actually solving the issues that it's faced by the world. So the US stopping funding is actually isolating themselves, and tomorrow they might be the ones begging the WHO for funds.
Okay. Mr. Mubarak, would you like to add something there?
Yeah. So this pandemic has caused so much damage to the world economy and so many countries and livelihoods. So in regards to the Donald Trump issue, yes, wrong that he's trying to pull in, but also on the other side, every year globally, countries spend billions of dollars on military spending. So I believe if we can channel that funds to healthcare and education, I believe with something like this, the world can be able to fight it, because as far as I'm concerned, the military spending right now doesn't help anybody, not even one country. So I believe the issue of funding, countries can do more by diverting their defense budgets to things like healthcare and education to help the economies.
Yes, yeah. I think you are absolutely right. That brings me to another question, which is related to what we are discussing now. Do you think, you know, the experience that that Africa had previously of fighting so many pandemics, and now with the challenge of COVID-19, and you know, on one hand we have WHO with limited funding, US freezing its funding, and other things happening. Do you think the African states now have to, or AU now have to think beyond these donor-driven programs, if they really want to, you know, develop health infrastructure or education in Africa? Because you can't be dependent on donors and international donor agencies for long. I think what Mr. Mubarak was also pointing out, what we need to do is the budget needs to be prioritized, and if money can be, you know, channelized from, say, defense budget to education and health, I think that reprioritization of state budgets needs to be taken. And I think bodies like AU needs to, you know, strengthen this kind of approach and make sure that the member organizations follow these kind of you know, directives and make these kind of changes in their internal budgets rather than completely depending on multilateral agencies or donor agencies for funds?
Well, I think the point which you've mentioned with regards the funding and trying to do things on their own as an organization, the AU would be able to do that. But you know, for such an organization and the continent which it's actually in charge of, that's Africa, and you know, Africa still has a lot to do in terms of, if you look at the GDPs per capita, you see that there's a lot of things happening with the economy. And Africa is solely dependent, and actually most of these countries are solely dependent on the mineral resources which they have. And those minerals are minerals that are being explored by foreign interests. So it becomes very difficult because also including corruption. Corruption, when I mean corruption, I mean something that's very endemic. It's even much more than the coronavirus, because that has been eating us deep also. Even right now with most of the donations that are going on, you still see a corruption in the system. So I think the only way that we can go about this is to educate people, because and by education, I don't mean a Western standard kind of education, but an education that is more focused on people using what they have to get to attain a certain height, you know, because when you talk about the intellectuals, we have a lot of intellectuals there in Africa, people who think very beyond our imaginations, but the only thing that they lack is that enabling environment. And for so many reasons, there is also a post-colonial mindset that's there that makes us feel that the standard that we should follow is a Western standard. And if it's not a Western standard, it's not up to the standard. So that also has to change. And for so many reasons, I believe this pandemic has given us that opportunity, because post this pandemic, people would, there's going to be a huge disparity between the rich and the poor. And a lot of people would have to adopt local products, local things. That way we can inwardly boost our economy. And if we attain economic and financial stability and independence, then I think we don't have much to do from outside.
Great. Paul, your comments?
Yeah.
What brings so much dependency on foreign donor agencies for Africa's development?
For me, I think that moving beyond donor aid is not going to be an easy journey for most African countries, because over the years, looking at a continent that's been plunged in several pandemics, looking at Ebola, even for Congo basically depleted their reserves. Congo was expected to have, an economic growth of about 5%, and it's falling back again to about 3%. So it's not going to be easy for us as a continent to move beyond aid. But aside that, we need to, know that we are all global citizens. If it's good in one country, it's also going to be good in another country. If it's not good in Africa, it's going to affect other foreign countries. So giving out this should be more of a sympathetic or empathetic, thing Western countries should do for African countries, also aid in development, because I believe when the continent develops, it has other positive effects on the rest of the world. For me, I think we soon we are going to think beyond aid, because for instance, looking at the African continent free trade agreement, which is supposed to go through if not for COVID, which I believe after it is going to boost internal trade within the continent. I think when that goes through, we are going to see significant changes in the trade sector. We are going to develop, get some more revenue for ourselves, maybe be dependent on this revenue. And I think if corruption and other basic ills in society are dealt with, good leadership, good governance, and corruption is dealt with, I think with time, soon, we'll move beyond donors after some time.
So we look forward to, to that day when African states would take on the responsibility and they'll have the funds for their own citizens, rather than depending on the international donor agencies. So coming to Mr. Mubarak now for a brief comment from your side.
Okay, I think most importantly in anything we do, we need sustainability. So we all know that the donor agencies, their funding and their support is not sustainable. So I believe the entrepreneurs in Africa do not invest in healthcare, because for this to be sustainable, you need entrepreneurs to be leading in the front, to open new hospitals, new manufacturing. As we have seen now, people have turned their manufacturing of clothes to manufacturing of PPEs. So I believe this is an opportunity for entrepreneurs. For everything to be sustainable, it has to be a business. So many entrepreneurs right now are thinking of doing something or partnering with foreign hospitals to open some hospitals here in Africa, which I think is the most sustainable, because donor agencies or all these agencies cannot fund our healthcare. It has to be sustainable with our manufacturing here, with also insurance. So right now I was part of a project of partnering to open a hospital here. So I think right now during this pandemic, it has shown us that we have to open that hospital. So I believe to move forward, there has to be sustainability, and also entrepreneurs have to be empowered, like it is everywhere in the world, from UK, from US. The government funds healthcare, but healthcare has been driven by entrepreneurs in the private sector, including in India. There are so many private hospitals that are leading in India. So I think in Africa also, for it to be sustainable, there has to be entrepreneurs moving forward in that direction to open hospitals, and also consumables manufacturing to make it everything cheap and also affordable for everyone.
Great. So that brings me to the last part of our discussion today. How do you see in the post-COVID era, how do you see Africa and African Union as a body will emerge, and what kind of role it can play in the new global international order? Because we have seen, in the last one decade, both China and US and Russia have been quite active in Africa in terms of trade, in terms of business, even in terms of, creating big infrastructure projects in Africa, whether it's dams or roads and, other infrastructure, projects are there. So how do you see in, maybe 6 months down the line, or maybe in next year, when a lot of global action would be happening in the post-COVID scenario, how do you think African Union and African states could play a more decisive, a more influential role in the international, maybe diplomacy or international relations? So very brief comments from your side.
Yeah, if I'll comment on that, I think one approach would be a Pan-African approach. Africa is very polarized because of our history of colonialism and all, but with a singularity, just like we have in the free trade zone agreement that has been signed, I think, with all the countries. And I think Ghana is actually where the headquarters is situated. So I believe, because this is something which we're also committed to in Excellent Africa, we would be able to woo a lot of foreign direct investments from India, particularly because a lot of the hospital here and the Indian economy is dependent of foreign patients who come here for treatment, and there'll be a low interest in traveling abroad post COVID-19, because the social distancing mindset and the lockdown mindset would still be there. People would think things are not yet safe. Even to receive people would not be safe as to go out. So I think the only way that a lot of businesses can continue and flourish would be to invest in healthcare sector, just like MRK, my brother from MRK Group has mentioned also. So we'll be able to do a lot of investments to Africa, and with our government support and individual support and network, we'll be able to not just help Africa in developing their economies, but also the economy of the world.
Great. Paul, your brief comment about the post-COVID global scenario and Africa's role there.
For Africa, or for the world in general, the pandemic is going to have a strong impact. As the World Bank has already hinted, our growth rate is going to move from about 3% to about minus 2.1% in the near future, which means that it's going to be gloomy for most African countries, because there's going to be lack of funds. For us as African countries, I think the next step to take to make ourselves more powerful in the global world is to invest more in human capital, because looking at the age demographics, Africa has a lot of youthful age, And post-COVID, what we need to do is to invest hugely in our youth in terms of education, science, in terms of entrepreneurship, because looking at this pandemic, we've realized that there's a lot of innovation within Africa when youth are innovating, developing a lot of several hand washing machines that you need to use without touching them, PPEs, as I said earlier, companies developing sanitizers. I think moving forward, a lot of African leaders have noticed that we need to develop our human capital and our health system. And I think other countries are really working hard at it, because most huge, like a giant in Africa, Nigeria, is going to be really hit by the pandemic because of their oil dependence on their oil resources and other mining. Other countries that engage a lot in mining are going to really be affected. Other countries that, depend on China in terms of trade, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt. I think for us, most leaders have noticed that we need to work better at developing human capital and our health system. And I think most of them are doing that. I think post-COVID is going to be hard, but we'll sail through.
Great. I think that's a wonderful point. Mubarak, your brief comments?
Yeah, I think this pandemic has opened our eyes to new things. Normally, it is easy here in Nigeria to import things from India or China. But right now, as most ports, airports are closed, so it has put countries to a big test. So right now, I think it's very important for us to have healthcare security, in the sense that we have supplies or consumables that we need. We don't have to rely on any other country. Like right now, a university in Kaduna State, Zaria, Ahmadu Bello University, is producing hand sanitizers. So I think countries need to invest also in healthcare security. In case anything happens, a single country can rely on itself.
I think we're not able to hear Mr. Mubarak. Yes, I think
because
yes.
Right now, as we are very reliant on, like I said, countries should have healthcare security, in the sense that countries should be able to manufacture the consumables they need in their country, because right now you can't import consumables from other countries. It's very hard. So if countries can have at least basic consumables individually, it will help a lot in the healthcare system.
Great. I think this pandemic somehow has also provided an opportunity to all the countries globally to reprioritize their policies and programs, keeping in mind the welfare of their own people. In Africa, I think with 14% of global population residing in Africa, and a majority of that population is youth, I think Africa has a great edge over a lot of other countries in terms of investing in their young population, in the youth, in terms of innovations and education, and providing them social security and employment. And I think the post-COVID era, what I feel is the next decade will have a huge potential for Africa. And I look forward to have a more unified African voice in the post-COVID global scenario. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today in this discussion. Iziogo, Pearl, Mubarak, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from India.
Yeah.
I think it was a wonderful discussion. And this was the first in the series of discussion we have planned for the coming months. And Africa Talks will continue to bring in more issues of relevance, where Africa, which are on high priority for Africa, not just for African people, but for the entire globe and for everyone. So thank you so much for watching today's episode. Thank you so much, all our three panelists, for connecting with us.
Thank you.
And we look forward to have another wonderful discussion next week. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.